Welcome back to Administer Virtual Network in Azure. Now, we're looking at the next part in our virtual networking, where we'll look into a little bit more adding security to our resources. For this, we're going to go into a bit more detail around looking at network security groups. Now, first of all, let's discuss what is a network security group and how it operates. For this, I'll take you into a whiteboard to explain some details. As we go back into the whiteboard that we were working on from the previous parts, looking at my virtual network environment, we can see currently, if we look at traffic flowing within my virtual network environment, typically there is no control or security as per se for these resources. So if there was some traffic that's within this virtual network traveling into this subnet, currently it can flow in any resource that is within this environment. Ideally, the traffic would have some sort of an end address and will land onto the right resource. However, it still reaches all the network interface cards where they are ejected, and again, not picked up by the virtual machine or the resource that's working within the virtual network or the subnet. Now, to avoid this traffic from traveling within my virtual network between different subnets, what we can do is we can introduce a security mechanism that can add a layer of filter, a filter that can sift through different details that are coming through as part of my traffic or network traffic. Now, just to do this, let me bring in a small icon here to look at my network security groups. So let's steal this out and bring this into the demonstration. Now, let's bring this into my virtual network. Now, before I go into explaining some of the details around network security groups, let's talk about some of the details that we should understand around this. How does it actually work? So, network security groups, NSGs in short, typically look at 5 tuples. Now, what are these 5 tuples? Typically or commonly used with most of your resources that you're working with in your environment in terms of managing network traffic flow. You're looking at IP addresses, you're looking at ports, and you're looking at protocols. Now, you might say, well, you said 5, there are only 3. Well, with IP addresses, you can look at source and destination IP address, and we can do the same for the ports, so source and destination port. So this is where you can see different or 5 different parts of this traffic. So IP, ports, and protocols. Now, your NSGs would rely on these 5 tuples. That simply means that NSG is able to look at traffic coming into a network inside of a virtual network and filter traffic through based on some of the rules that you may define on any one of these options. Let's have a look at a couple of things before we start talking about what these rules look like in my NSG. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is, where do I plug my NSG? Now, typically, the NSGs live inside of your virtual network. So they're not floating inside of your virtual network. They must be associated to a resource within your virtual network. They're not going to be associated directly to a virtual network, so they don't live on a virtual network. They typically are plugged onto a subnet level. So this is one place that you can see your NSG plugged on. The other place, if I can choose, okay, so it doesn't. All right, so let's try bringing that in out here for a minute. Let's make a copy, and let's try that again. So let's try that, make this a little bit smaller because we're going to use this in here. So let's apply them again. So one of them is going as part of my virtual my subnet, and the second one is going to be assigned on my network interface card. Now, typically you can have a setup a bit like this, where I can have a energy associated to a network interface card and have a energy associated to a subnet, or the subnet where that particular virtual machine or that network interface card lives. Let's call this VM5 for just now. So I can have this scenario also set up in my environment, but this does not have to be always the case. Let's talk about some of these details to understand what this looks like. Now, if I look and talk about some more details over here for a minute, for just a quick reference, as we mentioned, that energies can be associated to a network interface card, or they can be associated to a subnet. Now, one thing that's important to understand over here is that typically when you have a subnet that's already associated to a network interface or to a network security group, it cannot be associated to another network security group. However, I can create one energy and associate that to multiple resources. So this one energy that we have can be then associated to many other network interface cards, and at the same time to many other subnets if I needed to. So it's again a setup that we can have. So I'll just represent network interface cards a bit like this, and let's assume S for subnet, just to explain that one energy can be plugged to many of them. So again, that's something that we can do if there was a need for us. Now, if I'm creating within, for example, within my virtual network that I have on the screen, 3 different subnets, and I am going to plug in a network security group for all 3 subnets that have exact same rules, it might be possible that I simply create one energy and plug all 3 subnets with the same energy, and I don't need a new energy. However, you might have a different requirement for different subnets, and you can, in that case, create a new energy for each subnet in that place and plug them on there. And that's perfectly fine. It all comes down to your requirements. And again, part of your planning of what your virtual network should look like, you'll also bring in security as part of that plan. Now, apart from that, like I mentioned, just to emphasize on this, a resource like a network interface card or subnet, once associated to an NSG, cannot be then associated to another NSG. So that's something important to bear in mind. If you are looking to move them, you'll need to first deallocate them from that NSG and then assign them to a different one. All right, now, apart from looking at just association of a NIC and multiple of these, one thing that comes to mind, what happens in the situation that we have currently running on the screen right now for my HR subnet. I have 2 different things going on over here. I have NSG that's applied at the subnet. I have an NSG that's applied at the network interface card level. How does the traffic then filters this data through? Now let's try and see if we can recreate that environment over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm creating my virtual machine here. I am going to drop out the network interface card just as a separate resource to this just out here, and we'll place the subnet right here just for the explanation of this part. Now, let's assume I have an NSG, and let's call this as 1, or in fact, let's create some more space for this. Let's create it again. Let's call this NSG1, and let's create an NSG in here, and let's create another NSG at a subnet level. Call this NSG2 and block this out as well. So this is my 2 different layers of NSGs, just to resemble the setup that we have going on at the moment in my setup. So NSG at the subnet level, NSG at a NIC level. So what happens to that resource that's going through with some of this setup? Now let's assume we talk about a type of traffic coming through. Let's talk about inbound traffic coming in. Let's take an example. This is a web server that we've configured in the backend. Now for a web server, typically we'll assume that it needs some sort of traffic coming through either on HTTP or HTTPS. So let's take example of an HTTP protocol, which typically works on TCP port 80. Now, if this traffic is coming into this web server and I've applied NSGs, like I mentioned before, it can filter through either your protocols, your ports, and IP addresses. I can here create a rule that will simply suggest if I am going to look at allowing port 80 from any of these energies that I have. Now, what happens in different scenarios if I did or did not? Let's have a quick look at that. Let's assume in the subnet level, I don't open port 80 or don't allow port 80. In that case, the traffic comes as it's coming inbound, it will come as far as my subnet and the traffic stops there, doesn't go any further. However, if I enable this at my subnet level, and I don't enable the port 80 at my network interface card level, in this scenario, the traffic goes past my subnet, so it's now within my subnet area. However, when it reaches this particular network interface card for this resource, Virtual Machine 5, it will stop there. It won't go or reach as far as my web server because the network interface card is not accepting traffic on port 80 because of the network security group. So for me to ensure this traffic is allowed in completely, I'll need to ensure that this traffic is open for business on both these NSGs for it to allow this traffic coming in and reach my web server in the backend. So again, very, very important to understand. A lot of the time I've seen in troubleshooting NSGs in real scenarios that people have implemented NSGs either at both levels and they're not aware of it because of the implementation or the planning. And when they have trouble in getting traffic through, they typically go into the NSG and enable the port. However, they don't realize that they're only performing the action on one of the areas and not on both. And they assume that they've now opened the port and the traffic should go through. However, the traffic will still not go through because there's another part of an NSG that's blocking that path. So it's worthwhile checking that if you have multiple NSGs applied and both of them are open for business. Now, these NSGs are stateful resources. That means they're clever and they're not simply taking yes or no rules for coming in or traffic going out. So if I'm enabling inbound traffic for port 80, it's clever enough to understand that there might be some traffic outwards as well. So it can manage that for me automatically. I don't need to necessarily go and configure additional rules for it, unless you want to explicitly define a particular rule for different to inbound to outbound. All right, now let's jump back into the portal for a minute and let's try and see if we can create an NSG rule and talk a little bit more about how NSG rules look like. All right, I'm back into my portal and what I'm going to do is simply go into the search bar and type in NSG and look for network security group and we'll go into it. Let's start creating a new one for this particular demo and let's hit create. As usual, on the basic tab, we're simply going to be asked for the 4 key things. So we'll choose our resource group, we'll choose our a name for this NSG. Let's call this demo NSG1. If I can type, there we go. So let's try that again. Demo NSG1, so we can remember what this is. And we're leaving this in UK South region for today. Again, we can tag this and we can hit create and review. And let's verify or let the system validate everything is okay. We can verify the information by looking at the screen and we can hit create once we're happy. So that's all you need to do when you're creating an NSG. So only the 4 basic details to create an NSG. However, the creation is not as difficult as compared to you planning the rules that you're going to configure within an NSG. So that is something that becomes more important because you creating random rules could allow or deny traffic for your resources in the backend. Let's have a look at the resource. It's ready, it's created. Let's jump into that back onto the portal. Let's have a look at it. Now, I am currently in my demo NSG as we just created it. Currently, just as a quick overview of this, I can see where it's placed in my setup and also some more details around that. Currently, I can see It suggests there are no custom rules created. We haven't done anything with it yet. We just requested Azure to create one for us. So it's created one, but there's nothing currently going on in there. So no inbound, outbound rules are defined as yet. Currently, it's not associated to anything. So we haven't associated it to any subnet or a network interface card. However, if I look further down, I can see some details popping on the bottom of the screen talking about some rules that are already there. So I'll come back to some of these rules just in a minute and discuss the rules in a bit more detail. Now, before we do that, let's talk about some more details on the site. We said we can associate this NSG to a network interface card and subnet. So let's have a quick look at that. So if I go into my subnet and click on associate, now typically we can look at any resources that I have available that I can associate this subnet, this NSG to. However, only the subnets that are currently not associated to any NSGs would be visible for me here. If I switch this around to, let's say, another setup, and I've got subnet 1, again, I've got some resources available there. Now, if I try another, just want to see if I can pick one that already has currently no resources available for it to choose. Again, typically it doesn't show you them. However, sometimes you can see some subnets popping up, and it suggests right here in the setting cannot be associated because it's already associated to another subnet. Now, just for this particular demo, I am at random going to pick one of these virtual networks, which we are not working on with at the moment. So let's go, in fact, we can actually go with the one that we created earlier as part of virtual networks. So let's go with our virtual network so we can associate it to subnet 1. So we are looking at the demo VNet that we created and assigning it to subnet 1 and say OK. Now this is as simple as you associating an NSG to your subnet. Now you can associate same NSG to multiple subnets like I mentioned before. So if I wanted to go and pick another one from in here, so I can associate more to this. Now we can go back into demo VNet and you can see it suggests now cannot be associated to network security group because it's already done. We can see that in the background there. However, if I was to choose another subnet or another virtual network to associate this, it should typically work straight away, and I can assign that to another subnet as well. So let's just do that as a quick demo. And let's see if I can drop in that subnet there too. So that's 2 subnets associated to it, and I can do more. Now, if I go into network interface card, so now I'm using the same NSG for network interface cards and subnet, which is possible in Azure. You can do that. However, I'm not so sure if there would be a requirement for anyone to use the same NSG for a same subnet and the same and a virtual machine that lives within that subnet. However, there could be a need, and if there is, the system doesn't stop you from doing that. Now, if I go into looking at associating resources, what this typically will do is show me if there are any available network interface cards in my setup as we stand, and if I can associate my resources to them. However, you can see there's a list of some of these that are available, visible, but they're not available. They cannot be used simply because most likely all of these are already connected to another NSG. Like I mentioned before, one resource can only be part of the one NSG at a time. However, the NSG can then be associated to many different resources. So it's good to understand that one-to-one and one-to-many relationship with NSGs. Now, I'll leave associating this NSG to a network interface card just for this part of the demo. Later on, when we create resources, we'll start looking at connecting NSGs to network interface cards. So let's step back onto the overview for a few moments and have a quick look at some of the changes that's happened. Now, in this part, if you can see the associated part, currently this network, this NSG is associated to 2 different subnets. Now, let's move on from here, talk a little bit more about what is actually going on in this NSG. as we created this energy earlier on, we did not define anything particular apart from just choosing some basic details. The subscription, the resource group, the name, and the region. And the system automatically created the energy for me. Now, as I come within the energy settings, there are certain inbound, outbound rules that are already available for me to look at. Now, if I look at the details, these default rules that we have already, these are there by default in all the energies, and they cannot be deleted or edited. Now, if I look at the far end of the menu, there is a delete button, however, it's grayed out, and I can't click on it, and I can't go into these rules to edit them. So there's no option for me to edit these rules. I can't hover onto them, can't click onto them. There's no ellipsis at the end of that bar, so I can't see nothing, so I can't edit them. So these are default rules, so they are fixed and I can't get rid of them. So it's important to know some of that. Now, the rules have some sort of a priority number. Now, this is important to understand. So these rules work based on a priority number. The default priority numbers that we get to see are 65,000 range. And if you look carefully, the very first rule I have is 65,000. The next one is 65,001, and then we have 65,500 rule. So 3 inbound default rules. The same series follows again in the outbound rules. However, some of these rules are slightly different. Let's pick them up and understand what each one of them does in my environment. The first one that we look at, which is called the allow VNet inbound communication. Now, this is typically looking at the virtual network setup. That simply suggests that if there is traffic within my virtual network environment, let it travel through within the virtual network, as long as it stays in that same virtual network. It will not block it, because by default, this is allowed. Now, let's move on to the next rule. The next rule over here talks something to do with Azure load balancers. We cover load balancers a bit later on in module number 6. So we'll talk more about this rule and what it does. Typically, the load balancer has a small check that it performs to your resources to ensure they're alive before you can send the traffic to them, which we'll refer a bit later in the course. However, this traffic by default is allowed and is not stopped by the NSG as the default setup. Everything else inbound currently is denied. So there is no traffic apart from these rules coming through. Now, if I was to assign this NSG to my existing scenario, let's have a quick look at the whiteboard. So if we go back into my existing scenario and refer to the scenario of virtual machine 5, where we have an NSG at the subnet level and an NSG at the network interface card level, and we are considering traffic coming through to this resource, again, for the current setup that we have for the rules, the 65,000 range that we are looking at, 65,000 rule that we see suggests that traffic going from this resource, either staying within this subnet or traveling out of this subnet going to another subnet, in as long as it stays within the virtual network that we have, is currently allowed. So the inbound rule priority number 65,000, this is how it would work. Now, the next rule that we saw was 65,001 rule. Now, this particular rule suggests that if I have any of these virtual machines part of a load balancer, which we'll talk about a bit later, like I mentioned, if they are part of that setup, if the traffic is coming through to my setup, well, again, let's take this traffic to the network above, as we don't have NSG in the diagram, just to explain. So if I have traffic coming through this NSG into a subnet that has resources that are part of a load balancer to verify these resources are alive or ready and working, in that case, this is allowed without any further obstruction from the NSG. And the last rule that we had was 65,500 rule. Now this rule suggests deny everything. Now if that's all I keep and I assign this energy to this subnet and I try bringing this traffic in for port 80 for my resource, typically what will happen is it will look down the stack of the rules that we have in this energy and go through all the rules looking for anything for port 80? No. Anything for port 80? No. Anything for port 80? No. Oh well, we are down at the bottom of the stack that suggests deny all rule, and the error that you probably will see over here that will suggest deny all. Now if you're ever seeing a deny all rule hitting hitting your resources and you're troubleshooting this, bear in mind that you have forgotten to create a specific rule that defines the kind of traffic that you are bringing in through that NSG. So this is where you need to start bringing in custom rules to assign how the traffic should work apart from the default rules that we have. All right, let's jump back into the portal. Let's create a custom rule. All right, we're back into the portal. As we were looking at our energy rules, like I said, we have a stack of default rules currently for the 65,000 priority range, and that's how they are listed. Again, the smallest number will always sit on the top of the list and the highest number will fall down at the bottom of the list. These are the default rules. We are looking to create a new rule for our scenario where we're allowing traffic for port 80 for a resource that we've got working in the back end. Now let's go into inbound security rules from the blade and start creating a new rule. Now as I go into this, I can simply start looking at adding a new rule. And in this case, I am asked a few choices to pick from. Things like source. Where is this traffic coming from? Again, we can fall back onto the 5 tuples that I mentioned earlier on. So we can define details like IP addresses. Have a specific IP address where the source of this traffic is, or I can leave it blank if I don't want to define that. So if my incoming traffic is not coming from a specific setup, we can leave that blank. However, if I want to restrict this traffic only coming from a particular network or IP address, at this stage, I can define that. Only traffic coming from this source IP address is allowed in, or not allowed in. So I can control some of that, but we'll leave it blank for now. We'll leave it open for any traffic coming in. Again, I can define that to be more specific. Hey, Azure, pick my current IP address for the setup, which will be my public IP address that I have right now. Along with that, we can also choose service tags. Now, Microsoft uses service tags for all of its services. For example, Microsoft.storage, Microsoft.sql, and many other services that have tags available to them. Instead of defining a particular IP address for that service, I can open this connection to that service using the service tag. So I don't have to define a specific path. If and ever this virtual network needs to connect to a service like, let's assume, a storage, and if I've defined a rule for it that if you ever connect to storage, allow or deny depending on the rule I create, then that rule could work generically for that service that I might be looking at. So this could work quite nicely depending on your setup. Now, one last option that I have here is application security group. Bear with me on application security group. We'll talk about this just at the end of NSGs. That'll bring this back into the conversation. So bear with me on that. Now, I'll leave my source for now, any. Traffic coming from anywhere in the world, because it's a web server that we're creating. I want to allow people to be able to see the web page that I have. In the back end, port ranges, this is where I can define the source port, where it's coming from. Ideally, I should narrow this down based on the traffic I have. Just for this demo, I'll leave it open and leave it all or any for now as well. The destination, here again, we can define where this traffic is landing, the specific IP address of the resource in the backend that I'm working with. So that virtual machine in my demo, like the VM5, which we suggested is a web server. However, we don't need to. For this demo, we can leave it open and say any resource in the backend you're going through, because I might be planning for this NSG at a subnet level to control traffic for more than one resource in the backend and not just one single resource. So again, I can choose some of that and leave it defined or leave it open. Just for this demo, I'll leave it open. Like I explained before for the source, we have same option for my destination as well, but we'll leave them out for now. We'll leave it any. The next thing we can do is choose a service. Is this a particular type of service? And I can choose the protocols I know or would require for them to work. As you can see, there's HTTP here already. Or I could do this by defining a port. Again, it's something that you may choose. I could simply go here and type in port 80 and work with that and define if it's a TCP port 80. Or I can simply go into this and say, hey, it's a HTTP protocol that I'm working with. And it automatically goes and defines port 80 and TCP for me anyway. Or let's try a different one just for the sake of it. Let's go RDP, and you can see changes to 3389 and TCP. So it has some of those details already defined. Now let's stick to the example that we're working on with HTTP or port 80 opening in the back end. And all I will go in here and choose, am I allowing this or denying this? Now by default, I don't need to create a deny rule specifically for a resource, simply because I already have deny all that sits in the bottom of my stack on the rules anyway. So there's no need for me to explicitly define deny RDP, deny HTTP, deny other resources. I don't need to. They're already denied. However, there might be a need for someone in their setup for their environment to explicitly go and deny something. And if there is a need, by all means you can. But there's no need for it. By default, it will automatically be denied. Now, I'll create an allow rule. And let's go and define a priority. Now, this is interesting to see that by default, the priority numbers that we were hitting are 65,000 rules or a range, or only 3 different ones. And in my priority that I am looking at currently, it starts off 100. Well, I don't want to start with 100. What options do I have? This particularly ranges between 100 and 4,096. Now, this is very important to understand. I can create any number from here. However, the highest priority level that I have is 100. That means 100 would be the top priority rule if I ever need to create. There's no rule that will go above it. The smallest the number, the highest the priority. So if I'm creating multiple rules in my environment, based on the priority number, that rule will hit first. Let me explain that just a little bit more after I've created this rule. Now let's pick a number from in here. There is, again, some limitation. We mentioned in module 2, limitation and quotas per subscription. This particular limitation over here we have is a maximum of 1,000 rules per subscription, per NSG per subscription. Better to rephrase that. So 1,000 rules per NSG per subscription. So I can obviously create more in other NSGs. So that's a maximum rules I should have in one NSG. Now that's already quite a few rules to define within a single NSG. If there's a need for it, by all means, go all out. But you have quite a few numbers to pick from. Now that doesn't mean, hey, I have about 3,000 some numbers, I can create 3,000 rules. Not really. You can simply create maximum of 1,000 rules, but from the range that you have. By default, if I started with a number, again, it's a recommendation that you start away from 100 number. So don't start at 100 because that's the highest priority rule. You always want to leave some gap above or below this so you can add rules as and when needed to either override a rule or allow deny things for a certain period of time or make some changes to your setup. So leave that gap for yourself. Let's start with the 500 range. Now, I've seen administrators working with 1,000 range. I've seen administrators jumping on 2,000 range. Makes no difference. It all comes down to your planning and how you prefer working with some of these resources and jumping on the range that you like. I'll start with 500 and create a rule. And I'll hit add. Typically, add description to explain why you created this rule. Again, if you're collaborating with others, they can understand what changes you're making and why. So I'll add this rule. Because this rule was 500 rule, typically it will sit on the top of the stack that I currently have, because smallest the number, higher the priority. Now, if I was to go and create another rule, let's do this very quickly just to explain some more details. Let's this time go and create another rule. Let's this time create a rule for RDP. And I'm going to allow that as well. However, as I come further down, you can see the system automatically predicts that I am carrying on with my 500 range and jumps to 510. So by default, the system automatically jumps 10 in tens in your rules. You don't need to keep with it. You can do 501 if you want the next rule, 502 after that. You choose. You can plan them accordingly. However, it might still be worthwhile keeping it with a part with 10 different numbers, simply because you can then introduce another rule in between if there was a need for you ever. Now I'll leave it as 510 for now, and I'll hit add. Now, just for a simple explanation of one particular scenario, I'll add one last rule and we'll stop creating rules. And in this case, I'm adding a deny rule, and this time I'm leaving it as a number 520, and I am going to hit add. Now, let's explain what we've got so far. On the stack of the rules, we've created 3 custom rules. Like I said, these custom rules are something that we can delete, we can edit, we can amend them. I can go back into any one of them and simply go and change their settings. I can change their priority number if I needed to. So all that is possible. I don't need to worry about once it's created, it will stay there forever. I can change if I needed to. There was a need for me to go and amend the priority or the rule settings. I can at any time. Now, let's look at the details here very, very quickly. I have 3 rules that we've created: 500, 510, 520. Now, 500 and 520 are based on the same resource, TCP port 80, which will be for my HTTP traffic, and one of these rules is allowed and one of these rules says deny. Now, if you are looking at how this will work, if I had both of them applied, typically the traffic flows from the top of this stack and goes downwards, looking at the highest priority rule first, and then move down the stack. As soon as it meets a rule that's defined for that traffic, it stops there. Doesn't need to go any further. In this scenario, the traffic will stop here and say, hey, I'm allowed. And it wouldn't be stopped, it will carry on working. So it doesn't even need to go further down the stack to look if there was another rule for port 80 suggesting something else or similar stuff. Doesn't need to worry. As soon as it hits a rule that's defined for it, it'll stop there and it will carry on with whatever that rule is. That's why the priority numbers are very, very important. You switching priorities around, for instance, if I now go into my setup over here and change the deny rule priority to, let's assume, 490. Now, 490, obviously, smaller the number, higher the priority, will sit above my allow rule. And now I can see the deny rule sits on the top. So when the traffic comes in for my HTTP, it'll hit the deny rule first and it will be denied, regardless of another rule that says allow, because it sits at a higher priority in my setup. So I'm hoping that makes sense in terms of number of rules, the priority settings, and how it works. Again, like I was saying before, if you're ever getting an error message that suggests deny all rule, now the easiest way to troubleshoot that particular issue is go and check, do you have a rule that's defined for that particular service? Now, because it's going all the way down to the bottom of that stack and hitting that rule, that means you have probably missed out on defining a rule for that type of traffic. So that could be a good way to troubleshoot your rules. Right, now just for the last part before we stop talking about NSGs, during the creation of my rules, I mentioned a terminology called application security group. Now, let's quickly look at a whiteboard to understand what an application security group is. All right, let's have a look at application security group. Now for this particular part of the session, let's pick a color that I don't have going on the screen at the moment. Let's choose yellowish orange and work with this color. Now, what is an application security group and how can I use it in my environment? Now, typically an application security group, or ASGs in short, are nothing more than us grouping virtual machines together. So this is particularly designed for me grouping my virtual machines inside of my NSGs. Now, this grouping can only be referred back in NSGs, as you saw me doing earlier, and I'll show you how it looks like on the portal in a minute. Now, the purpose of me doing this is simply labeling certain virtual machines with this label called ASG and creating a particular rule for them. Let's take an example. Let's, for argument's sake, say in my sales team, instead of looking at just the 5 of the virtual machines I have, let's assume I have 50 of them. Now these 50 virtual machines that I have, out of these 50 machines, I have 20 that are web servers, and I need certain rules set for these web servers. I have 30 that are servers but are not web servers, so I don't need traffic going to them. So, or let's assume the web traffic going to them. So we'll work with port 80 again. So I have web traffic coming only on the 20. Well, you could suggest, well, go and create 2 NSGs, Walid. That will solve your issue. You have one NSG that allows port 20, assign them to the 20. You can create another NSG and you can assign it to the 30, and you can get away with just doing that. Fine. Now, out of these 20 web servers that I have, only 5 of them require another port opening called HTTPS. So they use secure side of things along with HTTP. Other 15 don't need that. Now, you might suggest, you know what, well, you'd go and create another NSG and then assign a separate setting for the 5 that we have. And if I keep on adding other complications to this, or the scenarios to this, you might simply keep on saying add another NSG. Now remember, one thing I'll keep on saying across throughout the course is least admin effort. We want to achieve these tasks or these outcomes with the least effort from an admin and still have what we need. Now, instead of me creating multiple NSGs and managing multiple NSGs in my environment, what I can do is I can simply go and create an application security group. And using application security group, I go into my virtual machines and start labeling them, saying, hey, you're part of my ASG1, you are part of ASG1. And again, similarly, I can go and label those. And in my rules under the NSGs, I can call out saying a rule specifically for ASG. Allow port 80 for anyone that's part of ASG. And it will simply look at the traffic coming into the network environment to suggest, hey, are you part of ASG? Oh yes, there's traffic coming for you. If you're not part of ASG, then you are not getting this traffic coming through to you. So this is something that we can use as an additional option for just virtual machine for labeling them in this environment. One last thing before I show you the demo in the portal. Once you create an ASG, typically it's not associated to anything. However, the very, very first resource you start associating to your ASG, this ASG bounds itself to the entire virtual network that you're working in and cannot be reused for any other virtual network. While you're in the same virtual network, you can plug this ASG to as many virtual machines as you like. However, you can't then plug in or label any other virtual machine outside of this virtual network with the same ASG. Again, you might want to create other ASGs for that particular scenario. All right, let's have a look at this in the portal. All right, we're back into the portal. And one of the first things that we need to do before we start defining the rules within the NSG is go and create an ASG. So let's have a look at that. Let's try typing in application security group. And there we are. Let's pick up application security group from the list. Now let's go and create one. And let's pick up some basic details like we've done before. The 4 key areas: subscription, resource group, and the name. Let's call this demo ASG and add 1 at the end for the sake of it. And we are good to go. We can hit create and review, and that's all we need to do to define an ASG, just like the NSG. Not much in terms of defining it. However, once it's defined, like I said, it's not currently associated to any resource and it's not tied down to anything as yet. It's just requesting Azure to create us in an application security group. Once it's ready, let's have a quick look at how it looks like and go into it. There we go. Let's go into it. And now, just as a quick overview of this, unlike NSGs, there are no rules in here. There's no settings I can configure as for our scenario right now. We can't see any other details apart from the basic details that we created. Now, how this actually looks is a bit like this. Like I said, this is particularly for my virtual machines that we're working with. So what I am going to do is very quickly go into one of my existing virtual machines. Let's trigger one of them on and have a quick look at some of the settings within this virtual machine. Now, I'll talk about virtual machine in a different module. Just for now, I'm going into an existing virtual machine that I have, and I'm simply scrolling down to the bottom of the screen to find the networking settings for this virtual machine. Now, as I get to the networking tab, I am simply going to, networking settings in my virtual machine. I can see I have a tab over here for application security group. And if I click on that, it suggests this current virtual machine is not part of an application security group. However, if I want to, I can click on add and see the application security group that we just created and tick on that and hit add. Simply adding this particular virtual machine that I have called app S1 to be a member of that application security group that we just created called demo 1. And that's it. This is how you allocate it. However, the minute I do this, this ASG can then only be restricted to the virtual network that app S1 belongs to, the virtual machine that I have. So this is something important to bear in mind. Now, let's stop this part of the demo here. I'm not going to assign this resource that application security group. All I need to do is hit OK and it becomes part of it. Let's jump back to my NSG that we were working on, assuming we've now got a resource that already has a few resources, or the 20 resources that we wanted covering in my example, and they already have that assigned, that ASG tag assigned to them. Now, going back into my demo NSG 1 for today, looking at the rules that we were working on. One last time, we've created one more rule. This time, the rule that we are creating, if I go into hitting on add, we are going to look at assigning this, saying if the destination, remember the traffic is coming inbound, so looking at my resource, so from outside coming into my resources, I can now choose application security group, and in here I can define, hey, if the traffic is coming in for my demo ASG group 1, then in that case, allow this traffic through. So any resource in the backend that has that particular label assigned to them, that ASG assigned to them, if they have a traffic of, let's assume, let's define, we said HTTPS. So if the traffic is HTTPS based, it's only allowed if your resource is labeled with demo ASG1. And that's the rule that we've just created. Let's put the menu away for a minute, have a quick look at this, and let's define this detail here. Now, this is the new rule that we've just created. In this case, the destination, which is going to be internal to my virtual network, because traffic is inbound in this scenario, you can see the traffic is only allowed for resources that have that label for 443. And any other virtual machine or network resource that I have in that subnet would not allow 443 unless they have that ASG label attached to them. Now, this brings us to the end of the second part of Administer Virtual Network. Let's resume back into the last part, talking about DNS.